Well, as has been the case for as long as I can remember, the attention of most of the world is focused on now the Middle East. We know from what's been going on in Europe, France, and the UK in particular, are wanting to raise Cain about what the Jews are doing in Israel, the poor Palestinians, and blah, 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 blah. And so the whole world is focused on the Middle East. Many have been and continue to be confused about that armed conflict and the endless violence that permeates that entire region, especially that tiny nation of Israel. They question why it is that the Jews and other peoples in that region, almost all of whom are descendants of the patriarch Abraham, seem incapable of working out their differences and attaining some level, anyway, of peaceful coexistence. Why is that such a hard thing to do? If they only understood the identity of all of Abraham's descendants, they would also be asking why it is that so many of the nations which are descended from Abraham play such major roles in the world today. The descendants of Abraham not only possess the greatest amounts of natural resources, they also produce the most food, have the greatest military might, and basically control the economy of the world. These are Abraham's descendants doing these things. But how did this come to be? How did it happen? And why does it seem impossible for different families of Abraham to get along? The answers to the present world configuration are all found back in the past. We must go back into history. In order to understand the answers to the why questions, we need to go back to the origin of these nations, which all have their beginnings with Abraham, which the Bible says is the friend of God. He, Abraham, is the friend of God. It's amazing. He can have God as a friend, but his descendants seem to be incapable of having, friendship between one another. Back in Genesis chapter 12, let's go back to the very beginning of this relationship that God had with Abraham. We go to chapter 12, verse 1 of Genesis, and we read, "Now the Eternal had said to Abram, 'Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed.' So Abram departed as the Eternal had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Then Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree of Moreh. And the Canaanites were then in the land." Now the land was called Canaan, the land of Canaan. It was called Canaan because Noah's grandson, Canaan, originally dwelt there. As he moved from basically Ararat, they began to move and spread out after the situation there at the Tower of Babel. But he originally dwelt there, and he named the land after himself, and certain of his descendants stayed there for a while. But that was before they moved on into Africa, because Canaan's descendants went to Africa. The Canaanites then, as mentioned here, the Canaanites were then in the land. These were the people named after the land. They were named after the land. These were the people who populated the land after Canaan and his immediate descendants left that area and moved on to Africa. So that's the reason for the name of the land. All right, going on in verse 7, "Then the Eternal appeared to Abram and said, 'To your descendants I will give this land.' And there he built an altar to the Eternal who had appeared to him. Now, God again called Abram here, and he promised him the land of Canaan. One point that we do need to keep in mind from here on is the fact that God has the right to promise and give whatever he wants to whomever he wishes. He has that right. Doesn't matter who was there first. God has already determined certain things, as we know from what we read in several scriptures. First of all, here in Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse 14, we find that Moses brings out the fact who ownership of the earth belongs to. Indeed, Deuteronomy 10:14, indeed, heaven and the highest heavens belong to the Eternal your God. Also the earth and with all that is in it. So everything belongs to him because he created it all. He's the one that fashioned it and created it. In Psalm 24, the 24th Psalm, and verse 1, we read, the earth is the Eternal's, belongs to him, and all its fullness, everything on it is his. The world and those who dwell therein. So every human being belongs to him. Doesn't matter who. Every piece of land, every speck of dust belongs to God. Back in Deuteronomy again, chapter 32, we'll note that God has always had a certain intention regarding certain parts of this earth. In Deuteronomy 32 and verse 8, here Moses referring to this, when the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the boundaries of the peoples, that is the various nations, according to the number of the children of Israel. He knew the amount of land that he was eventually going to give to those who would prevail with him. Israel, remember, the name means prevailers with God. And so there was a certain part of the earth that he was going to give to those who would prevail with him. And that was, again, he set the boundaries of the peoples of the nations according to the number of the children of Israel. Now, the Apostle Paul gives us a little more detail of exactly what that means back here in Acts chapter 17. Acts 17 and verse 26. And I'll read this from the New Living Translation. It seems to bring out the meaning of, I think, more clearly. But here in Acts 17:26, from one man, he, that is God, created all the nations, that is through Adam. Throughout the whole earth, he created every nation. He decided beforehand, he predetermined or predestined when they should rise, these various nations, when they should rise and fall. And he determined their boundaries, exactly the boundaries that they would eventually have, or the boundaries that they would lose. This means that even though people were living in the land of Canaan at the time that God appointed it to Abraham or to Abram, God only considered those individuals to be squatters. They were squatting on his land, and he allowed them to squat on the land until the time he had appointed to give it to Abraham and to Abraham's descendants. In chapter 13 of Genesis, then, let's go on about Abraham. Here in Genesis 13 and verse 5. Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. Now the land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The Canaanites and the Perizzites then dwelt in the land. So Abram said to Lot, please, let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Notice the example of Abraham. Let's not have any strife. Let's not have division. We are related. It didn't carry on to his descendants, but that's the way it was with Abraham. He set the example, but it wasn't always followed. Going on in verse 9, is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, then I will go to the right. Or if you go to the right, then I will go to the left. And Lot lifted his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. And then we're told parenthetically, before the Eternal destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Once he did, it became pretty much a desolation or a desert as it is today. Except for, well, it's still a desert even though it's irrigated. Like the Garden of the Eternal. It was like the Garden of Eden when Lot said, I want it all. Like the land of Egypt as you go toward Zoar. Then, verse 11, Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. So Lot was kind of greedy. He took what was, frankly, the best, because what that left Abraham was the mountainous area, all the rocks and everything that's on the land of Israel today. Now, verse 14, and the Eternal said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward, for all the land which you see I will give to you and your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants could also be numbered. Arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I give it to you. So we find here that God expanded his promise by decreeing that the land, which included most of the eastern Mediterranean, would belong to Abraham and his descendants after him. Now, going on to chapter 15, when Abram was more than 80 years old, God came to him in a vision here in this chapter, which prompted Abram in this vision to ask God if the descendants that God had promised him would come through an adopted son. That's what he wanted to know because of his age. I mean, he's already more than 80 years old. So in verse 5 of Genesis 15, then God, brought him outside to answer his question. And he said, look now toward heaven and count the stars if you're able to number them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. And he, Abram, believed in the Eternal. And God accounted this belief to him for righteousness. Then he said to him, I am the Eternal who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land to inherit it. And he said, Lord God, how shall I know that I will inherit it? Look, I'm over 80 years old. I haven't had a child. How do I know? So he said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Then he, Abram, brought all these to God, cut them in two, down the middle, placed each piece opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds in two. He put one on one side, one on the other. Then, and when the vultures, verse 11, came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, a horror and great darkness fell upon him. Then he said to Abram, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and I will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterward they shall come out with great possessions. Now, as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age. Remember, he died at 175. He lived 100 years after God first called him. He was 75 when God called him. He died 100 years later. All right, verse 16, but in the 4th generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Now, this ties right back in with what we read in Acts 17, verse 26 a few minutes ago. This was the time, again, the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. The time God had decided beforehand when they should fall was not yet. God had already determined how long he would allow the Amorites to be there. And when that happened, then the boundary, they would be removed. They would no longer have possession of that territory. Verse 17, and it came to pass when the sun went down and it was dark that, behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a burning torch that passed between those pieces. On the same day the Eternal made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. So God promised Abraham all of the land between the Nile and the Euphrates. That's a huge chunk of territory, especially compared to what we look at, that little tiny, less than the size, the land mass of New Jersey. That's how small Israel is. When you look between the Nile and Euphrates, that's a pretty good chunk of territory. Now, verse 19 goes on. The Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, he goes on talking about, these were the peoples who were in possession of the territory of Canaan at the time that God made this promise to Abraham. Abraham still lacked any descendants to multiply and possess the territory that God had promised when we come to the end of chapter 15. So we move on then to chapter 16, verse 1. Now, Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "See now, the Eternal has restrained me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her," which was the way it was done in that time. There was, a surrogate parent in that way. And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. Then Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. So he was now 85 years old. He was 75 when he left Haran. Now he's 85, 10 years later. Verse 4, so he went in to Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. Then Sarai said to Abram, "My wrong be upon you." Or better translated, I think, as far as the intent in the New Living Translation, "This is all your fault, Abram. It's your fault. You shouldn't have listened to me. I gave my maid into your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, I became despised in her eyes. The Eternal judge between you and me. You shouldn't have listened to me. This just didn't work out like it was supposed to." So Abram said to Sarai, verse 6, "Indeed, your maid is in your hand. She belongs to you. Do to her as you please." And when Sarai dealt harshly with her, she fled from her presence. Now, the angel of the Eternal, this was the same one as Melchizedek. This was God the Word, the God of the Old Testament, as we normally use the term. The angel of the Eternal found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, Sarai's maid, where have you come from and where are you going?" So Hagar answered, "I'm fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai." The angel of the Eternal said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand." Then the angel of the Eternal said to her, "I will multiply your descendants exceedingly, so that they shall not be counted for multitude." And the angel of the Eternal said to her, "Behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael," which means, "whom God shall hear." God will hear. "Because the Eternal has heard your affliction." So you're going to name him because he's heard you, your appeal. "He shall be a wild man." That is, he would be a proud, free, untamed man with, frankly, nomadic tendencies to move from place to place, like the Bedouins, the Arabs today, and others. "His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him." He's not going to tend to control territory like others would, but again, moving from place to place. "And he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren." That is, he would be mixed in with the other descendants of Abram, which, again, we will continue to find out who those people are. So, verse 15, Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael, as God had said he should be named. So this was Abram's first offspring, Ishmael. Now, 13 years after the birth of Ishmael, we go on to chapter 17. And here in verse 1, When Abram was 99 years old, the Eternal appeared to Abram and said to him, I am Almighty God, walk before me and be blameless. And I will make my covenant between me and you, and will multiply you exceedingly. Then Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be a father of many nations. So Abraham, now his name is being changed in the next few verses, would be the father of many nations. Verse 7, And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you and their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and your descendants after you. Also, I will give you and your descendants after you the land in which you are a stranger, all the land of Canaan, as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. I will be the God of your descendants. The covenant, which guaranteed ownership of the land, would be passed on through patriarchal birthright to each succeeding generation. Now, we move on to chapter 21, picking up more of the story of his descendants. Here in chapter 21 and verse 1. Chapter 21, verse 1. And the Eternal visited Sarah as he had said. And the Eternal did for Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Now Isaac was born and given the name Laugh, because that's what Isaac means, it's laugh. And that was because Sarah, remember earlier, laughed to herself when when she heard God tell Abraham that she would have a son. Back in chapter 18, verse 12. Chapter 18, verse 12, she laughed. And so God says, fine, you're going to laugh. We're going to do things, Ishmael's name because he heard Hagar call, and Isaac is, he's named after what Sarah did when she couldn't believe what God was telling Abraham. How's that possible? All right, moving on here in chapter 21 down in verse 9. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, scoffing. Therefore she said to Abraham, Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, namely with Isaac. And the matter was very displeasing in Abraham's sight because of his son. But God said to Abraham, Do not let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad or because of your bondwoman. Whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice, for in Isaac your seed shall be called. Yet I will also make a nation of the son of the bondwoman, because he is your seed. So God promised to make a nation from Ishmael because, again, he was the offspring of Abraham. And God promised, God said, okay, your descendants are going to become great. They're going to be many nations. All right, going on in verse 14. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water, and putting it on her shoulder, he gave it and the boy to Hagar and sent her away. Then she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba, and the water in the skin was used up, and she placed the boy under one of the shrubs. Then she went and sat down across from him at a distance of about a bow shot, for she said to herself, Let me not see the death of the boy. So she sat, New Living Translation better goes on, she sat down by herself about 100 yards away, which is about the length of a bow shot as they figured it, and lifted her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the lad, who at that time was, again, 13, 14 years old. That was it. I mean, he was not, he was mid-teens probably. Then the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, What ails you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him with your hand, for I will make him a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the lad a drink. So God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness and became an archer. He dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So by taking an Egyptian wife, that made his children 3/4 Egyptian, because he himself was half Egyptian. So with a full-blooded Egyptian wife, his descendants were 3/4 Egyptian. Now, Ishmael was the first of Abraham's descendants to grow into a great number of people. Let's go on to chapter 25 and verse 12. Now, this is the genealogy of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's handmaid, bore to Abraham. And these were the names of the sons of Ishmael by their names according to their generations. The firstborn of Ishmael was Nabajoth. That was his firstborn. Then came Kedar, Abiel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadar, Timot, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedema. These were the sons of Ishmael, and these were their names by their towns and their settlements, 12 princes according to their nations. Again, 12 comes up a number of times. You know, Japheth, I think, had 12 sons. I mean, we find this number over and over again. Verse 17, these were the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years, and he breathed his last and died, and was gathered to his people. They, that is, his people, they dwelt from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt. New Living Translation goes on, in the direction of Ashur, or Assyria. He died in the presence of all his brethren, or the complete Jewish Bible has, he settled near all his brethren. I'm not sure the complete Jewish Bible is most accurate there, but that's what it says. So we find here that Ishmael had 12 sons who lived in the area, and what it's talking about here is from the tip of the western finger of the Red Sea all the way down the eastern flank of Egypt to the main body of the Red Sea, and that was during Ishmael's lifetime. They spread out all through that area. And then they spread out from there on into Arabia and Media and places of that after the death of Ishmael. But again, those 12 basically inhabited that area around the Red Sea and, again, the fingers of the Red Sea. Now, before we proceed any further, we do need to review some of the facts about Ishmael. Number one, he was to dwell in the presence of all his brothers. Now that means all that were related to him. And he was related through Abraham to Isaac, the 6 sons of Keturah. Remember, Keturah became Abraham's wife after the death of Sarah. You know, after she died at, 100, I think she was 129 or something. After she died, he then married Keturah. And so he had 6 sons by Keturah. Then there were the other children of Hagar that she had after she married, and they were called the Hagarenes. So the Hagarenes are the descendants of Abraham through Hagar, or not really through Abraham, but you know what I mean. She was Abraham's wife at one time. Then there were Esau's descendants, and the sons of Abraham's cousin Lot, which were Moab and Ammon. So all of those, he was to dwell in the presence of all. So he was scattered among all of these other descendants of Abraham. Because remember, Ishmael was scattered around. He was like a wild man. He wasn't, settling in just one place and calling this home. Now, another thing about Ishmael, because he was the son of a slave, he did not have the rights of the legitimate son of a patriarch's wife. He simply did not have that. A third fact about Ishmael is there are no recorded complaints from him about losing the birthright to Isaac. Not one time do we find any complaint about that. Also, there is no recorded hatred that Ishmael had toward Isaac. If he had any hatred, it's never mentioned. He married an Egyptian, as we saw. He lived, again, a nomadic lifestyle. And most importantly, he did not attempt to defy God's will concerning the birthright. Because we're going to find out other descendants of Abraham had a problem with this. Now, we need to keep these facts in mind as we continue the story of Abraham's other descendants. So let's go to chapter 26 of Genesis and verse 1. It says, there was a famine in the land besides the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. Now, there are a number of Abimelechs because that was a title, like Pharaoh was a title. Abimelech was a title, okay? There was an Abimelech in the time of Abraham. This is not the same Abimelech because he'd be really, really old, and it's unlikely. So this is another Abimelech, probably a descendant, king of the Philistines in Gerar. Verse 2, then the Eternal appeared to him and said, that is to Isaac, do not go down to Egypt like Abraham did. Don't do that. Live in the land of which I shall tell you. Dwell in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For you and your descendants I give all these lands, and I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham your father. And I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give to your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So all of the territory and all of the blessings which God had promised to Abraham, including having the Messiah as a descendant, God now passed all of this on to Isaac. This was part of the patriarchal birthright. It was passed on to Isaac. Now we need to keep in mind, as we move through this material, that what God had told Abraham was not kept secret. That is, Abraham didn't keep this under his hat. Sometimes we fail to remember there was a lot of Abraham's life that we have no clue about. You know, he lived 175 years, and we've only got snatches here and there of what happened. But as we move this material, we need to keep in mind that, again, it was not secret information. During the time that Isaac was growing up, Abraham, no doubt, told Isaac the full story of his relationship with God. Going all the way back, he called me out of the land of Haran and Ur of the Chaldees, and I moved down, and he made this promise and that. And again, he told him everything, including the great blessings that God promised him would be transmitted on to Isaac. Isaac, this is what you've got in store for you. This is what's going to happen. God's going to do this for you too. Now, we must look at the descendants of Isaac now, all of which are the descendants of Abraham, since Isaac was the legitimate son, to understand the origins of the other Abrahamic nations. Let's go back to chapter 25 and verse 21. Chapter 25, verse 21. I'll read from the New Living Translation. Again, seems to be a little clearer here. It says, Isaac pleaded with the Eternal on behalf of his wife because she was unable to have children. The Eternal answered Isaac's prayer, and Rebekah became pregnant with twins. But the two children struggled with each other in her womb. So she went to ask the Eternal about it. Why is this happening to me? She asked, and the Eternal told her, the sons in your womb will become two nations. From the very beginning, the two nations will be rivals. That's why you're having all of these problems. No, you haven't eaten something too late for all of that movement throughout the night. Nope. That's because there are rivals that are in your womb. One nation will be stronger than the other, and your older son will serve your younger son. Now, this is what God told her. Again, God made himself available to Abraham. Remember, he came to him on a number of occasions with the two angels on his way to Sodom and Gomorrah. And, so she was well aware. She heard him talking to. So she went to see him. And was he at Salem? Was he in the area of Jerusalem as Melchizedek? We don't know. It doesn't say. But nonetheless, she went and she spoke directly to the one who was God the Word. Now, God had already determined which son, before birth, he'd already determined which son he would use in carrying on the major promises that he had made to Abraham. This knowledge obviously affected Rebekah's attitude toward her sons from the very time they were born, when she knew which was the older and which was the younger. It affected her greatly. She always, no doubt, because God's favorite was the second-born. So that was her favorite. She made him her favorite and showed Jacob a whole lot more attention. We're never told if she ever passed this information on to Isaac. I doubt that she did, or if she did, he thought, you just had a dream, I'm not so sure that this really, I'm not so sure about it. But whatever. I think she kept it secret herself. One of these days we'll find out. Her failure to pass any of this information on to Isaac would explain why Isaac favored Esau. Because he saw Rebekah neglecting Esau because she was also always showing favor to Jacob. And so there was this favoritism that each one had. And again, since Esau was being neglected, Isaac said, I'm going to compensate for that by showing Esau more attention. If she had told Isaac, why would he be intent later on of blessing Esau if he knew God's will was for Esau to serve Jacob? Again, we'll come to that blessing in just a few minutes. All right, let's move on. Verse 20, skip down to verse 29 of Genesis 25. Verse 29, now Jacob cooked a stew. Obviously, this was quite some time later, after the boys are both grown up. He cooked a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and Esau was weary. And Esau said to Jacob, please feed me with that same red stew, for I am weary. Therefore his name was called Edom, which means red. But Jacob said, sell me your birthright as of this day. Now, why would Jacob even suggest this to his older twin brother? Why would he do that? Especially at this point. This seems so incongruous. Well, because for all of his life, his mother Rebekah had repeatedly told him about the great blessings that were going to be his, because God promised his father these blessings. Blessings which were to be passed on to the son whom would hold the birthright. You have to have the birthright to get those blessings now. And so Jacob, at some point in time, we got to figure out how you can get the birthright. Well, Jacob saw this. Esau was dead to the world, wasn't thinking clearly, and so, realizing how physically and mentally exhausted Esau was, Jacob saw his opportunity at this time to fulfill his mother's desire and egging and receive the blessings that God had told her were to become his. Verse 32 goes on. And Esau said, look, I'm about to die. So what is this birthright to me? If I'm dead, it's not going to do me any good. Then Jacob said, okay, swear to me as of this day. So Esau, swore to Jacob and sold his birthright to Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau bread and stew of lentils. Then he ate and drank, arose, and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. He despised his birthright despite knowing what all that birthright entailed. No doubt, just as Abraham had told Isaac about the promises that God had made to him, so Isaac told his sons about those promises that God had made to him, which you could go back and read. Okay? So they were both. Jacob and Esau were both very well aware of what lay in store with the birthright. But Esau was willing to sell it because he was physically tired, and it didn't mean that much to him. The birthright, as we know, was what the firstborn received as his right of being born first. And that was, at least as far as the physical, a double portion, as we're told back in Deuteronomy chapter 21, I think verse 16 or 17. Okay, a double portion. The birthright automatically came to the firstborn. However, the actual designation of the double portion, or what came with the birthright, was not carried out until later. Toward the end of the father's life is when that was done. All of the ramifications of the birthright were confirmed at a blessing ceremony, at which time the blessings then that came with the birthright were enumerated. They were then enumerated at that point. So, let's go to chapter 27 and verse 1. Chapter 27, verse 1. Now it came to pass, when Isaac was old, and his eyes were so dim that he could not see, that he called Esau his older brother and said to him, My son. And he answered, Here I am. Then he said, Behold now, I am old. I do not know the day of my death. Now therefore, please take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me, and make me savory food, such as I love, and bring it to me that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die. So we find that Isaac was now ready to confirm the birthright. But Rebekah manipulated the situation so that Jacob could take Esau's place. Again, she's going to prepare a special meal. So we go on down to verse 22 after the meal is prepared, and we read, So Jacob went near to Isaac his father, and he, Isaac, felt him. He reached out, touched him, and he said, The voice is Jacob's voice. So his hearing, there wasn't a problem with the hearing. It's just he couldn't see. But the hands are the hands of Esau. And he did not recognize him because his hands were hairy like his brother Esau's hands. So he blessed him. Then he said, Are you really my son Esau? He said, I am. Didn't tell the truth here, but, in order to steal this blessing, he's got to do this. He said, Isaac said, Bring it near to me, and I will eat of my son's game, so that my soul may bless you. So he brought it near to him, and he ate. And he brought him wine, and he drank. Then his father Isaac said to him, Come near now, and kiss me, my son. And he came near and kissed him. And he smelled the smell of his clothing, and blessed him, and said, Surely the smell of my son is like the smell of a field which the Eternal has blessed. Therefore may God give you the dew of heaven, of the fatness of the earth, and plenty of grain and wine. Let peoples serve you, and nations bow down to you. Be master over your brethren, all that are related to you. And let your mother's sons bow down to you, specifically Esau's descendants. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be those who bless you. Same thing that we find God gave to Abraham originally back there in chapter 12. Jacob received the blessing. Part of the blessing involved his mother's son bowing down to him and serving him. All of this amounted to the double portion, and with this birthright, this particular birthright, it was much more than double. What ultimately came of this birthright, the blessings far exceeded a double portion. All right, we move on to verse 30. Now it happened, as soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob, and Jacob had scarcely gone out from the presence of Isaac his father, that Esau his brother came in from his hunting. He also had made savory food and brought it to his father, and said to his father, "Let my father arise and eat his son's game, that your soul may bless me." And his father, Isaac, said to him, "Who are you?" So he said, "I am your son, your firstborn, Esau." Then Isaac trembled exceedingly and said, "Who? Where is the one who hunted game and brought it to me? I ate all of it before you came, and I have blessed him, and indeed he shall be blessed." When Esau heard the words of his father, he cried with an exceedingly great and bitter cry, and said to his father, "Bless me, me also, O my father." But he said, "Your brother came with deceit, and has taken away your blessing." And Esau said, "Is he not rightly named Jacob?" which means supplanter. "For he has supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright." That's not true. Esau sold it. He took away my birthright, and now, look, he has taken away my blessing. And Esau said, "Have you not reserved a blessing for me?" So Esau, like Jacob, and seeing Isaac, they both were dishonest. They did not tell the complete truth. Verse 37, then Isaac answered and said to Esau, "Indeed, I have made him your master and all his brethren. I have given to him as servants. With grain and wine I have sustained him. What shall I do now for you, my son?" And Esau said to his father, "Have you only one blessing, my father? Bless me also, O my father." And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. Now Esau still qualified for 1/3. He gets 1 portion. Jacob gets 2. That is, of Isaac's inheritance. Just like Reuben lost the birthright, but received a blessing along with all of the other tribes of Israel, all of Jacob's other sons, so Esau could still receive a blessing. Maybe he thought he might yet be able to regain the birthright through a blessing. This is what was in his mind as following information brings it out. We find then in verse 39, then Isaac his father answered and said to him, "Behold, your dwelling shall be of the fatness of the earth and of the dew of heaven from above. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. And it shall come to pass, when you become restless," or as the complete Jewish Bible brings out, "when you break loose," that is, break loose from serving your brother, "that you shall break his yoke from your neck." Clearly something that happens very late at the close of the age. Esau was required from this blessing to gain his land and possessions by the sword. Jacob, on the other hand, was given much without the need of any sword. In fact, God was going to give him the whole land, drive out the inhabitants with hornets so they could just walk right in and take over. But Jacob's descendants, as we know, nope, they didn't listen to God. And so God says, fine, then you're going to have to do it yourself. I'm not going to do it for you. Verse 41, so Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, the days of mourning for my father are at hand. Then I will kill my brother Jacob. So what do we find here? Esau hated Jacob. He hated him. Why? Because he lost the birthright through carelessness, well, yes, and more. With carelessness to Jacob. He lost the major blessing through Jacob's subtlety, through which he had hoped to regain the birthright. He would serve, that is, he would be subject to his brother. And he lost the scepter and the right to have the Messiah come from his descendants. He lost all of that. And it finally dawned on him what all he lost. Now, since the major fulfillment of the birthright and blessings to Jacob has been within the last 250 to 300 years, since that's when it's been. It is reasonable to conclude the blessings given to Esau should have shortly followed. Esau was to serve Jacob until he grew restless and threw off the yoke of servitude. Some of this is going to come in the future. We're not going to have time to get into all of that today. Now, one thing I would like to do now is compare Ishmael to Esau. Okay? Ishmael, again, son of a slave woman. Esau, same mother as Jacob. Ishmael lost the birthright due to his mother's status. Esau sold his birthright due to not valuing the worth of that birthright. It was carelessness, but he did not value the worth. He just didn't see it. Ishmael did not attempt to regain the birthright, not at any point in time. Esau, on the other hand, hoped to regain the birthright through a blessing. Ishmael, no recorded hatred of Isaac. Not any place do you find any animosity that Ishmael expressed toward Isaac. Esau hated Jacob and planned to kill him in order to regain the birthright, because if Jacob was dead, that was it. It became his. Ishmael, God was with him and blessed him with many descendants. Esau, God was not with him, as Malachi chapter 1 brings out. Ishmael dwelt in the presence of all of his brothers, that is, he was scattered throughout all. Esau gained land and possessions using the sword against his brothers. Quite different. Ishmael lived a nomadic lifestyle. Esau was a hunter and a man of the field. And so those are the comparisons between Ishmael and Esau. Now, with that, let's go over to the genealogy of Esau. Chapter 36 of Genesis, because there's more necessary information here. Genesis chapter 36 and verse 1. Now, this is the genealogy of Esau, who is Edom. Verse 2, Esau took his wives, plural, from the daughters of Canaan. Note, he married women that were descendants of those who lived in the land of Canaan, of Canaanites. Adah, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. Remember, the Hittite Empire was massive, went all the way up, I think all the way to the Black Sea, maybe the Caspian Sea. It was a huge empire that disappeared all of a sudden, but they ruled all the way down until the time of Abraham. Remember, Abraham bought the field at Machpelah in order to bury Sarah there in the cave from a Hittite. And so here we find the Hittites being the most powerful of all of the Canaanites at that time. And so Esau decided, I'm going to marry a daughter of Elon the Hittite. And then there was Aholibamah, the daughter of Anah, the daughter of Zibeon the Hivite. So there's another powerful Canaanite tribe, less so than the Hittites. And he also married Basemath, Ishmael's daughter, sister of Nabajoth. Nabajoth, remember, was the firstborn of Ishmael. And so these were the three wives. Esau married two Canaanite wives and the daughter of Ishmael. Now, since the two, or that is a daughter of Ishmael's firstborn, since the two Canaanite wives were born in the land of Canaan, Esau believed that his descendants through those two wives should have rights to the land by reason of their mother's births. They were born in the land, so they had a claim to the land by birth, by reason of birth. Since Ishmael, as far as Esau was concerned, since Ishmael had prior claim to the birthright, he was born 13 years before Isaac ever came along, then Ishmael felt that the descendants of Ishmael's descendants should also have claim to the land involved. Through these marriages, Esau attempted to validate his claim to the land of Canaan, trying to override what God had promised Jacob. Verse 4, now Adah, the Hittite, bore Eliphaz to Esau, and Basemath, Ishmael's descended from Ishmael, bore Ruel. So Esau's firstborn was from the Hittite wife. That's what we're told. Then, verse 6, let's go to verse 6. Then Esau took his wives, his sons, his daughters, and all the persons of his household, his cattle, and all his animals, and all his goods which he had gained in the land of Canaan, and went to a country away from the presence of his brother Jacob. For their possessions were too great for them to dwell together, and the land where they were strangers could not support them because of their livestock. Note, both Jacob and Esau originally had incredible riches, because initially Jacob got twice, double portion, Esau got one. He got 50%. But considering how wealthy Abraham and Isaac were, we can obviously see why it was that Jacob and Esau both were very rich, very powerful peoples. And so one had to move out, and Esau chose to go south. Verse 8 goes on, so Esau dwelt in Mount Seir. Esau is Edom, we're told again. And this is the genealogy of Esau, the father of the Edomites in Mount Seir. These were the names of Esau's sons: Eliphaz, the son of Adah, the wife of Esau, and Ruel, the son of Basemath, the wife of Esau. And the sons of Eliphaz were Teman, Omar, Zepho, Gatam, and Kenaz. Now, Teman here, this first one mentioned, the sons of Eliphaz, Teman, means south. The name Teman means south. And they basically, we believe anyway, or have believed in the past, that the descendants in Yemen today are none other than the descendants of Teman primarily. So, again, as we know what comes out of that area, always consternation, problems, and so forth and so on. Now, verse 12. Now, Timnah was the concubine of Eliphaz, Esau's son, and she bore Amalek to Eliphaz. These were the sons of Adah, Esau's wife. Now, Amalek was the firstborn son of Eliphaz's concubine. That's what we're told. He's firstborn of the concubine. Since Eliphaz was Esau's firstborn son, and Amalek considered himself a firstborn son of Eliphaz, that's what he considered himself, Amalek saw himself as the one who was the rightful heir to all of the promises that were made to Abraham. Now, it could be that the concubine actually bore a son before either the Hittite or Ishmael's granddaughter. You know, she could have been the firstborn. Amalek could have been the firstborn of Eliphaz, which again was the firstborn of Esau. And so Amalek believed that, he was the one that should have those blessings. He's the one that should have the birthright promises. Okay, so what did happen to the birthright and the double portion of blessings? Well, we need to go back to chapter 48, on through Genesis, past the story of Joseph, chapter 48. And here in verse 13, Joseph has already, second position in all of Egypt under the Pharaoh. And now Jacob has brought the rest of the family into Egypt. And Joseph took them both. That is, Jacob wanted to bless Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's sons. So Joseph took them both, Ephraim with his right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh with his left hand toward Israel's right hand, and brought them near him, Then Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on Ephraim's head, who was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, guiding his hands knowingly. Jacob knew what he was doing, in other words. For Manasseh was the firstborn, and he blessed Joseph and said, now he blessed Joseph by blessing his sons. He blessed Joseph and said, God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has fed me all my life long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads, let my name, his name Israel, let my name be named upon them, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. Now when Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him. So he took hold of his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, not so, my father, for this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head. But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendant shall become a multitude of nations, greater because he would control more of the earth, is the way that's looked at. They both, Ephraim and Manasseh, received the blessing that went to Joseph, who was firstborn, which means the birthright blessings were shared between Ephraim and Manasseh. That's one reason Jacob crossed his arms. So he blessed them that day, saying, by you Israel will bless, saying, may God make you as Ephraim and Manasseh. And thus he set Ephraim before Manasseh. So this was an adoption ceremony as well as a passing on of the birthright blessings. Now, in chapter 49, verse 8, let's note something that was not passed on to Joseph's sons. And that's here in chapter 49, verse 8, Judah. You need to get this correct on this. Judah, you are he whom your brothers shall praise. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's children shall bow down before you. In other words, you are going to be the one that will provide the leadership. You're going to be the one that the other brothers will look to for the guidance as being their king. They shall bow down to you. Now, skipping down to verse 10, the scepter shall not depart from Judah. That is, rulership shall not depart from Judah. New Living Translation goes on, nor the ruler's staff from his descendants until the coming of the one to whom it belongs and the one whom all nations will honor. It will not pass from Judah, the scepter, rulership, until the one comes that all nations will worship. That is, until the coming of the Messiah. That's the way it will be. The only kings will be the ones who descend from Judah. So Judah received the blessing of the scepter, of the rulership. Joseph's two, Ephraim and Manasseh, received all the rest. Now, we go on here in chapter 49, verse 22, or back to verse 22. And here in the blessing, Joseph is a fruitful bough by a well. His branches run over the wall. Now, this was primarily a reference to what would happen with Ephraim, because Ephraim was going to be a colonizing people. You know, the British Empire. Okay, that's what this is talking about primarily. His branches run over the wall. Verse 25 goes on, by the God of your father who will help you, and by the Almighty who will bless you, with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that lies beneath, blessings of the breasts and of the womb. The blessings of your father have excelled the blessings of my ancestors up to the utmost bound of the everlasting hills. All of that pertains to both Ephraim and Manasseh. They shall be on the head of Joseph and on the crown of the head of him who was separate from his brothers. So Joseph received much more than all of the others combined. While Jacob's heirs were in Egypt, Esau's descendants, primarily Amalek, moved into southern Canaan. Moved up into that area, Mount Seir, southern Canaan, all the way down. They were there next to the Philistines. The Philistines were on the coast, and again, Amalek was right there next to them. So Amalek had kind of encroached upon southern Canaan by this point in time. We're told this back in Numbers chapter 13 is where it mentions the Philistines and Amalek being there close by. Amalek saw the move by Israel from Egypt when they finally came out in the Exodus. They saw that movement out of Egypt as a threat to the possession, the Amalekites' possession of the land, and they charged across the desert in order to attack the descendants of Jacob, to hopefully destroy them. That's what they wanted to do. They wanted to destroy them, because if they could wipe out the descendants of Jacob, the land was theirs. That's the way Amalek looked at it. Let's go to Exodus chapter 17 and see what all we're told here. Exodus 17, verse 8. Okay, in verse 8, now Amalek came and fought with Israel in Rephidim. And so we see here what was going on. Let's skip on down to verse 13. So Joshua defeated Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. Then the Eternal said to Moses, "Write this for a memorial in the book and recount it in the hearing of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven." And Moses built an altar and called its name, "The Eternal is my banner." Now, when it says here, write this for a memorial in the book, well, he wrote it in the book of Exodus, and recount it in the hearing of Joshua, that's in Deuteronomy. In fact, we'll turn there in a second. Verse 16, New Living Translation says, he said, that is, God said, "They have raised their fist against the Eternal's throne." That is, they have tried to circumvent the will of God. So now the Eternal will be at war with Amalek generation after generation. This declaration of war against Esau's grandson was due to his lack of the fear of God and his attempt to defy God's will by attempting to destroy Jacob's descendants in order to gain possession of the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, especially the land promised to Abraham and Isaac. In Deuteronomy 25, this is where Moses recounted the Amalek experience to Joshua. Deuteronomy 25, verse 17. The New Living Translation has, "Never forget," Moses was reminding Israel here in Deuteronomy, "never forget what the Amalekites did to you," that is, your ancestors and some of you, "as you came from Egypt. They attacked you when you were exhausted and weary. They struck down those who were straggling behind. They had no fear of God." They thought that somehow they would be able to gain possession of that birthright. But Amalek wasn't the only descendant of Esau to hold a grudge against the descendants of Jacob. In fact, let's turn back to Numbers 20. Numbers chapter 20 and verse 14. Numbers 20, 14. I'll read this from the New Living Translation. Again, I think it flows a little bit smoother. Verse 14, while Moses was at Kadesh, he sent ambassadors to the king of Edom. So they're way south in Kadesh Barnea. They're down, between the mountains and the desert and the wilderness and all of that. And now they want to move on up. It's getting close to the time for them to enter the promised land. So while he was at Kadesh, he sent ambassadors to the king of Edom with this message. "This is what your relatives, the people of Israel, say." Again, he reminded them, we're your relatives. We're related through Isaac. We're Jacob, you're Esau, we're related, all right? This is what your relatives, the people of Israel, say. You know all the hardships we've been through. It was very clear. Everybody knew what was going on in Egypt. Israel was down there. They had grown great. And so this is common knowledge. Even the Philistines were aware, what happened at the Exodus. And I guarantee you, if they knew, the Amalekites knew, all of Edom's descendants knew, they all knew what happened at the Exodus. That was worldwide news in that time. You know the hardships we've been through. Our ancestors went down to Egypt. We lived there a long time, and we and our ancestors were brutally mistreated by the Egyptians. But when we cried out to the Eternal, He heard us and sent an angel who brought us out of Egypt. Now, we are camped at Kadesh, a town on the border of your land. Please let us travel through your land. We will be careful not to go through your fields and vineyards. We won't even drink water from your wells. We will stay on the king's road and never leave it until we have passed through your territory. But the king of Edom said, "Stay out of my land, or I will meet you with an army." The Israelites answered, "We will stay on the main road. If our livestock drink your water, we will pay for it. Just let us pass through your country. That's all we ask." But the king of Edom replied, "Stay out. You may not pass through our land." With that, he mobilized his army and marched out against them with an imposing force. Because Edom refused to allow Israel to pass through their country, Israel was forced to turn around. Esau's descendants refused to allow Israel passage through their land because they were determined to give absolutely no help to Jacob's descendants in gaining the land out of which their patriarch Esau claimed they had been cheated. It had been passed down. No way we're going to help you. And of course we know Israel had to go further east in order to go around the area of Esau, of Edom and Mount Seir and so on. So thus far we've seen that the beginning of Esau's animosity toward Jacob grew into open conflict by Esau's descendants against God's will. They attempted to use their physical strength to take back the birthright and the blessings which God intended before the birth of the twins to give to the younger one, to give to Jacob. Next time, we'll look at more historical conflicts and examine end-time prophecies to better understand why the same perpetual hatred of Esau drives the endless conflicts occurring in the Middle East today.